Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, education and research.
Hello and welcome to the Gift of Gab podcast. I'm your host, Gabe, and this is the podcast where we believe every conversation can be a gift. Joining me for today's conversation is a nationally touring poet who branched out into music with his album Black Gold, which is now available on all major streaming platforms, as well as many other art forms under the heading of the New Renaissance, which we'll be speaking about a little bit today. He's based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he has an upcoming project called Show Up. And showing up for us today, I'd like to introduce Joe Davis. Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited. Appreciate you inviting me out.
So I had a list of questions, and I do want to get to those, but I wanted to start with a little bit of a current event, because the topic that we're talking about on the podcast this month is Black History. Because it's Black History Month. And I recently, well, actually, I guess it was just yesterday, I saw that there are certain education systems in different states that are allowing parents to opt their child out of learning the Black History curriculum.
Yeah.
And if there is anything in recent history that feels like a huge step backwards, to me, that would be it. But I guess, what's your take on that? I mean, as far as, I consider Black history our history.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people will get offended because it doesn't paint white people in such a positive light as they're accustomed to, but I don't think that you can have solid change without being accountable to your past. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I think that's super duper whack that they're trying to do that. But I think there's a long line of folks perpetually trying to erase Black folks currently and historically, right? A long line of anti-Blackness. But like, I look at Black history, just as you said, it's part of American history. It's part of our collective history, and you got to tell the whole story, right? I think about how, like, slavery, for instance, which is the first thing I learned about when I was in school about Black folks. But I like to think about how slavery isn't just Black history. Slavery disrupted Black history, and prior to that, there was this wealth, this like tremendous wealth of stories of, like, I think about Mansa Musa, who was considered one of the wealthiest people of all human history. He was the emperor of the Gali Empire in the pre-colonial era in Africa, right? And he was known for traveling the world and for having these grandiose processions where he would give people experiencing poverty, he would just give them gold. And all of his servants were like clothed in silk. And he was known for cultivating the arts and science and literature, right? And this is the type of stuff that I didn't learn about in school during Black History Month, right? I had to learn about this stuff by self-studying and by having other mentors outside of the public school system. And so I think even with what we have now, when the Black history is taught, there can still sometimes be a grave injustice to telling the whole story of our people, and I think if we want to live in a world that works for everybody, that actually humanizes everybody, then we got to tell everybody's story in the fullest capacity that we can. So
for sure. That's kind of a perfect segue too, into obviously, like, I would have had you on the podcast regardless, but specifically you're here because of your Black history of your own. Give us a little I guess not the entire story because we'd be here forever, but tell us about your experience growing up did you grow up in Minneapolis? Or
No, so my family is from all over the place, but they were actually stationed in Minot, North Dakota when I was born. So my dad's from Chicago. My mom's from Montego Bay, Jamaica, and immigrated to the States when she was a little girl. And they were both in the Air Force, and there's an Air Force base in Minot, North Dakota that I was born in. But I've been all across the country. I've never sat down and like counted, but I'm pretty sure I've been to almost every single state in the U.S. And I've spent some time in Jamaica as well. But yeah, and I've been here in Minneapolis for like 7-8 years now.
So growing up, did you, and if you did, what kind of, not compromise, but I guess like meshing together of different cultural backgrounds did you experience with having a mom and a dad who, even though they're both African American, come from like pretty different backgrounds culturally?
Yeah, I loved my upbringing with both my parents, and I have an older sister as well. But like I just think about it was pretty Black American upbringing. My mom, she kind of, I jokingly say she lost her Jamaican accent or got Americanized, but it still comes out whenever she gets excited or upset, like that Jamaican patois that you sometimes hear folks talk about. But so much of my upbringing was kind of, I feel like, would be typical of a lot of Black folks growing up in like a working class family. But yeah, I grew up eating a lot of Jamaican food and listening to Jamaican music, and I love that. Like we were just talking about Bob Marley before we came on, and so that's where I get my love of Bob Marley from, is from my mom and her side of the family. Even talking about spices and seasoning, she always had some curry spices and jerk spices she could really throw down in the kitchen. That's one of my fondest memories.
I'm having intense flashbacks to her jerk chicken and that mac and cheese.
Yeah. Famous Mama Davis mac and cheese.
Oh my gosh, it was so good.
Renowned for her cooking. That's one of her love languages, is just like, we talk about feeding the body and the soul. And so she would show you how much she loves you by, the type of meal she whips up. And she still does that to this day. That's been a big part of my growing up around food. And then my dad, coming from Chicago, military family. So I always talk about like kind of having a lot of rules and regulations to follow because of that. But then also they still gave me the space to be free and to be artistic and explore and experiment. So I'm grateful for that. I think there was a pretty healthy balance. So
now Minot is a relatively large city. How big is it? It's not North Dakota's biggest, is it?
It's like the second or third biggest. I think the biggest is like Grand Forks, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was Grand Forks, Bismarck, Minot. I could be wrong. If anybody's listening, you can correct me. But yeah, so it's like the third, maybe the second or third largest city in North Dakota.
The reason I asked is I know cities are generally more progressive than suburbs and rural areas, but even still, you have discrimination and racism, homophobia, lots of different stuff everywhere. But what was your first experience with facing that kind of adversity that you remember?
Yeah, I think about when I was a kid, one of the first times I recognized that racial difference could mean being treated differently was when I was in elementary school. And one time I came out of the bathroom and I couldn't find my teachers or my classes. And I was like looking all around. I went out to the hallway and was wandering around, and another one of the school administrators came out and saw me and walked me to the office, and they called my mom to come pick me up. And then I remember overhearing my mom, who was visibly upset, like talking to the administrators saying, how can the white teacher forget her only Black student when leaving for a field trip? And like, I didn't fully understand it at the time, but I was kind of able to kind of grasp some of the the, what I had just experienced. So that was one of the first times I remember, like having my race mean being treated differently.
Yeah.
Of course, there's like a bajillion other experiences, but that was one of the first.
How do you think that shaped, like, you've always been a pretty strong person, at least what I've known of you, very outgoing and confident. But I can imagine that having experiences like that, and like you said, there's probably a plethora that you could recall since that time. How do you think those have affected you as you've grown up, but also what active or maybe even subconscious things did you do to protect yourself to become the person that you are today and not allow those things to bring you down?
Yeah, I think there certainly has been a lot of resilience developed over the years, and I really want to credit like my family for instilling that in me and for teaching me to have a self-image and self-esteem and identity that's like deeper than what the world tells me. I just carry forward this whole idea of I am who I am because of my family. Dr. Cornel West, who's like a public intellectual and activist, he would say, I am who I am because somebody loves me. And so I think about my family and the way that they've always expressed love and expressed self-pride and dignity and respect. Those values are what made me and still make me who I am. And certainly like racist experiences, right? Experiences of racism have impacted me. And I think a couple of things in particular come to mind when I think about how they've impacted me. So one is, I think it's given me a lot of empathy and compassion for anybody and everybody who experiences any kind of oppression or marginalization or minoritization. And so because I know how it feels, I don't want anybody else to feel like that,
Right.
And then connected to that, it's also given me a passion for making sure that doesn't happen as much as possible. Like, how do we lessen the harm, not only around racism, but around sexism and homophobia and all of the isms that we can name? How do we try to eliminate that as much as possible, right? At least do what we can in this lifetime to make it a little better
Right.
for the generation after us. So
Right. I think a lot, I hate comparisons of types of discrimination, specifically racism as opposed to any other type. I mean, I'm gay and I knew that from a young age, and growing up, I felt discrimination, but the main difference is that's something that can be concealed. Islamophobia is something that can be concealed, so that when safety comes into question, you can provide that for yourself. But when it comes to racism, you can't just change the color of your skin for protection. And I think that's kind of affected historically how we've moved forward, or in some ways how we haven't. But speaking to that, were there ways that your parents kind of prepared you for what you were going to experience prior to, or was that something that was dealt with as it happened, or kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
yeah, I think it happened in both explicit and implicit ways, where explicitly, like, we would definitely have conversations. I remember talking with my mom when I was younger, her saying something to the effect of, I'm gonna have to work like twice as hard as like non-Black folks, because I'm gonna be judged by the color of my skin, and I'm gonna have to prove myself, and kind of just letting me know that that's the reality in which we live. And having those kind of conversations, and then talking to my dad about police brutality, and he's had multiple experiences of police brutality. But what to do if I ever am pulled over by a police officer? How to stay safe? How to come back home? Like that being a conversation that we had to have. So those sort of explicit conversations, but also implicitly just watching how my parents navigated the world and learning from them. Like, okay, not even like cognitively, like consciously saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do. But that's just how kids learn, right? Kids learn by watching their family members, right? And so just seeing how they took care of themselves, how they protected themselves, and just picking up on those same patterns, same habits, for better or for worse, right? Because I also think about how oftentimes we can have behavioral patterns that are meant to protect us, but then when decontextualized, like it can actually harm ourselves or other people. I'm trying to think of a good example. Like I do a lot of work around transgenerational trauma. Like I teach like healing justice classes and anti-racism classes, and we talk about, how we'll start, how transgenerational trauma like goes from person to person. For instance, if there was in the slave era, if there was a Black mother and her child, and the slave owner comes and sees the Black child and says, oh, wow, you have a really sharp young boy right there. And the mother, wanting to protect the child, says, oh, no, he's dumb. He's not very strong. And like just berating their child in front of the slave owner because they don't want their child to be sold, right? But then if that gets decontextualized into like our modern era, and you have a Black mother who's at a parent-teacher conference, and she's talking to a white mother, and the white mother says something about her son, and the Black mother says, oh yeah, my son's not really that bright, right? When really in reality, like the white mother knows that the Black son is actually really intelligent, but that damage is already done, right? And then maybe the Black son hears that and already kind of internalizes. I'm not saying my mother did this, right?
Yeah, Mama Davis, if you're watching.
Yeah, just to be clear, this isn't something that's happened in my family, but it's something that I have seen happen. And so that's when like some of those ways in which we protect ourselves can actually cause harm. And that's why we need like to first of all even be aware of it and figure out how we can heal and develop new and different patterns. But yeah, that's part of the story that we live in.
I think about like my own experience growing up and running into things in our society that just are batshit crazy or don't make any sense, and how frustrated that's made me. And thinking about, I can't even imagine the difficulty of being a Black slave and having to explain slavery to their child as they grow.
Yeah.
Slavery just pisses me off, first of all. But
it's bizarre. It's like a really absurd concept and institution that we still have today in a different form, because we can point to the prison industrial complex as the modern day slavery. It says it right in the Constitution.
I was going to say it's not completely abolished.
Right.
And I think, that blown up on a big scale is kind of the white understanding of the Black experience in America. Is there's this idea that seems more complete, that if you actually look at it, it's not the way that you think that it is. And I know for myself, until I started being around Black people, having Black friends, there is an ignorance that it gets broken when you see somebody having to experience things that you weren't aware of, or that you have never had or would think of having yourself. and I know you said that there was that pressure to, be even better because twice as good will only amount to good enough when compared to a white person. How do you think that is changing, or do you think that's changing generationally? Because Vera, who's the episode before this one, said that there was kind of like a subconscious feeling of that, but it wasn't something that she ever felt any sort of pressure from. Yeah. And obviously you said that you did feel that pressure, or that it was explained to you like that. And that's just within, our time period, a difference. But how do you see things moving now in that regard?
Yeah, I definitely feel like it's still there, but the change has come from, just as you described, when people are having experiences that deepen their awareness, whether that's a relationship or whether that's, a story, a book they read, or a film they watch, or that's why I'm a huge advocate of the power of the arts. Not just because I'm an artist, but I also think that's one of the most powerful tools we have in the toolkit for transformation, for deepening people's awareness, for helping them understand that, like, the human story, especially around race, isn't monolithic, and it's multidimensional, and there's like a multitude of stories, right? And so when people can start to encounter those stories more and more, then that expands what they think and feel about another human being. And so I think because of that, because we've had so many stories and so many Black folks who have been vocal and more visible, that has shifted the narrative to a certain extent. But we still have a long way to go, because so much of this is like codified in our Constitution, right? As in the laws, and is in other institutions and other systems. And that's the slow, deep, long work, right, that we have ahead of us to transform that as well. But I do like looking at it holistically. There have been changes, thankfully, and there's still a lot of work to be done as well. So,
yeah, I think you're right on the money with art being the most powerful tool that we have to affect that, because of the fact that art is experiential, and so that even if you're not necessarily experiencing it firsthand, being able to experience secondhand different situations, it is something that you take on. Getting back to your personal story, did that play a part in what affected where you went occupationally? Is that part of the reason why you were attracted to art as a career?
I think maybe even subconsciously in some ways, perhaps. I know that when I was younger, I never set out to be an artist as my career. I was drawn to art because for me, it was therapeutic, and it was healing, and it was empowering. A big part of my story as an artist is I was really, really sick when I was younger, and in and out of the hospital all the time, and being able to write my own stories and write poems and songs, that was liberating for me. Because when it was hard for me to talk about what I was going through with my family or with my friends, I could just pour my heart and my soul into my notebook and put the words out into the universe. And that like just gave me this sense of power and agency, and recognizing afterward, after people would receive my words, seeing that it mattered, that I mattered. And so that's why I was drawn to art. And then as I got older and saw other artists that I respect, even I just think of artists of the past, but certainly artists of now too. But some of my favorite artists, learning about when I was growing up was like Langston Hughes, of the Harlem Renaissance, who did poetry and jazz, and how he used that not only for self-expression, but also to speak against segregation and other dehumanizing laws. And then I think about other artists today. I'm trying to think of like a good example of artists who are really using art at that intersection of creative self-expression, but also to transform like our systems of injustice. I think once I started learning about those artists and encountering those artists, that's when I was like, okay, that makes sense. I see what's possible, and I wanna live more fully into that.
So getting a little bit into the present day from that, you spoke about Langston Hughes in the Renaissance era. With that, you had a current project. Well, explain the new Renaissance to us a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I love to talk about the new Renaissance because it was actually inspired by the Harlem Renaissance. That's my favorite era of Black art. In the 1930s and 40s, this explosion of excellent artistry from Black folks in Harlem, New York, right? And so I see the same thing still happening today, where I live in North Minneapolis, Minnesota, but even just across the United States. And so I was like, how can we continue to cultivate this and continue to carry forward that legacy of Black artistic excellence? And so as I was developing, concert series and theater productions, that's when I created the New Renaissance to kind of house my creative ideas around Black artistry. And so I officially started the New Renaissance a couple of years ago, but even prior to that, I was already doing concerts and other productions. But it wasn't until 2018 actually that I officially launched an LLC. And so the New Renaissance serves as a space and as a multimedia production company to just amplify Black artistic excellency. So that's what it's all about.
I think I know that you had been doing stuff prior to that were in the same vein, but I think that there's something to be said about names and what they do, not just for the people who come in contact with that entity, but also for the entity itself. I think that it plays a big part. And I think that's super cool. I think it's also a kind of along the lines of standing on the shoulders of giants and continuing the journey. So obviously, we've had this progression in America that led eventually to the first African-American president, Obama, being elected. Vera spoke about how she had just feelings from the response to that what would follow would be the opposite side of the pendulum swinging, which we have definitely experienced. I didn't think that orange was the opposite of black, but I guess it is.
Black, I guess they have a whole show.
Were you in Minneapolis when George Floyd passed?
Yeah. I was here.
I don't even want to say passed, was murdered. Because I think that playing down in the language is harmful. But tell me about your experience of that.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying to this day, I still haven't watched the video. And the reason why is because that sort of thing happens far too often. And I've learned years ago that for my sanity and mental, emotional, spiritual well-being, that I can't watch that type of violence done to Black bodies. And so I distinctly remember that day, and I had posted online that morning prior to hearing or seeing anything about George Floyd. I was like writing about love, and I was like working on a poem, and I was, speaking of like love as a redemptive, radical, revolutionary, transformative force, something to that effect. And then later on my social media timeline, shortly after having posted about that, everyone was talking about it, right? And then videos were posted, articles, or things were written about it, and I already understood what had happened. In a sense, I was like, there's another unarmed Black man that was killed. A lot of folks know about the Twin Cities because of Philando Castile, who was also unarmed and shot and killed by a police officer in his car next to his girlfriend with their child in the back seat, right? And so, as I said, these sorts of things happen far too often. And I saw that and my heart sunk. And like I said, I refused to click on the video because I already was like, I don't want to see this. I don't need to see this. Like, but I wrote a kind of follow-up post and said, hey, I was writing about love before. I'm still going to write about love. But when I say love, I mean a love like fire, right? And this was like before the city like felt the fire of what can happen when people are beaten down again and again and again. And I think that's what that was all about. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says that a riot is the language of the oppressed, right? And so what happened to George Floyd, when George Floyd was murdered, that was just a manifestation of what's been happening again and again and again. And so what the world saw as Minneapolis's response was saying, we don't want to see this happen again. Like, when is this going to stop? When is this going to end? And so the weeks following that, I remember there was a lot of smoke. There were lots of rallies and marches and peaceful protests. Some of them not peaceful, some of them were peaceful. Always intentional to point to that both things were happening, and oftentimes, depending on which news source you watch, you're only going to get one side of the story. And there were people coming in from out of town that we in this community know came just to start trouble. We stopped people from breaking into buildings and causing further damage. And my spouse was helping with the cleanup afterwards. Her and I went to some of the peaceful protests. We were actually at the one that was on the highway where a semi truck came up behind us. We were there when that happened, if anyone's seen that on the news. And that was really traumatizing. But ultimately, like, I was just trying to hold space for healing and hold space for us to keep that flame going, but allow it to be a flame of love and a flame of justice.
Yeah. Vera made an excellent point when I spoke with her about when you talk about racism, it's going to get political. Okay. Yeah. And obviously, and we'll get to discussing the events of January 6th in a little bit, but, now we're experiencing this push from the right for everybody to just move on, and for a lack of accountability. And I think that true love holds accountability. And I've always been a proponent that you can't fight fire with fire, you have to fight it with water, and you can't fight hate with hate, you have to fight it with love. Could you expand on the idea of what a love like fire is?
Yeah, for me, it's a persistent love. It's a fire that can't be extinguished. It's a healing fire, a fire that melts away all that doesn't serve our collective highest purpose. Because sometimes we forget that fire is a gift. Fire is beautiful. Fire can warm people and bring people together. It cooks our food. It helps us create and build things, right? So fire is necessary for life, right? That's the type of love that I'm speaking of. And I think sometimes people can misuse that fire to harm themselves and others. But ultimately, what I'm speaking of is about collective healing and justice. And I like to say, we all got the spark. I just came to fan the flame. So how do we carry forward that flame
In terms of violence, what do you think the line is, or what do you think the I mean, when I hear people talk about how, you know, the protests were violent, I'm thinking to myself, you be oppressed generationally for since the beginning of time almost, or at least from our collective remembering, and tell me that you wouldn't be violent, especially in the face of a response of, well, now, you know, settle down, like we'll get to it, or whatever. And so I believe that on some level, like if there is no change, sometimes violence is necessary. But what do you consider, at least personally, to be like, what would be the push for that, societally, that would make that necessary? Or what do you think prevents it from happening? Obviously change of some sort.
I think
I feel like I really butchered the articulation of that question, but I feel like you kind of understand what I mean.
Yeah, I'm tracking. Yeah. I mean, there's always that question of violence and nonviolence when it comes to movement work and freedom work and Black liberation. And I really think about, you know, Malcolm X. He said any means necessary, right? But he was also in that same context, he was referring to self-defense and protecting those that we love, protecting our community. He wasn't talking about a strike against another person, right? He's talking about protective use of force.
I think that's sorry to cut you off there for a second, but I think that's another example of how decontextualizing does harm. Because I see a lot of quotes from Black people and Black allies that are often taken out of context intentionally to do harm. But continue what you're saying, speaking of self-defense.
I appreciate that. That's like a needed point, right? And even in this whole conversation around violence and nonviolence, it's like sometimes people in positions of power will ask that question divorced of the context. Because if someone's getting bullied and pushed and shoved and oppressed for generations, and then one day they're like, they push back, and then someone's like, why are you being violent? Like, that's such a focused question to ask.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah, and that's what it is in the larger context, right? But when people are living in like different worlds and having completely different experiences, then they're gonna come to different conclusions about, you know, what they're seeing and hearing on the news, or, you know, so I think that's what happens so many times in these conversations. Someone who, as you said earlier, like having those experiences that deepen your awareness about what Black folks are experiencing. If there's a white person who doesn't have a lot of relationships with Black people, and maybe their only encounters like somebody at work, or, you know, a few times on TV, and then they see an uprising occurring in Minneapolis, then their conclusion might be, why are these people so violent? But if they have a deeper understanding and a deeper awareness that this is the result of generations of systemic oppression, and these are people who, you know, we're raising our voices, we're pushing back to create change, to be freer, to be our whole selves and have human dignity, then, you know, there's more of a clearer, fuller picture. That's the whole context. But,
you know, saying the word freer makes me think that if that is an option, then you have to question what your freedom is. You know, because we speak about how America is a free country, but obviously if there are people who feel that they could be freer, then there has to be some sort of imbalance within society. John Lewis just passed away recently, but he always started. One of my favorite quotes is he said that you need to start good trouble. How do you think there are ways to start good trouble? Not just on a personal level, but for people that might be watching this, for them to do in their own communities to kind of bring about that change?
Yeah. I always talk about just impacting the 3 feet around you. Since we're in COVID now, you might have to say the 6 feet around you. But, like, who are those people and those places that you actually have influence, that you can actually impact? What are those conversations that need to be had? What tools and resources do you have that you can use to further the healing and justice and liberation of all people? And so, like, that might just look like someone literally having a conversation with their family members at the dinner table, calling them out if they say something racist, right? I like to talk about calling people out and calling them in, because you're calling them out of behavioral pattern that's harmful, calling them out of that, but you're also calling them in to deeper relationship and calling them into deeper humanity and deeper community, right? And so how can we practice calling out and calling in with the folks around us, right? How can that be one of our practices? And how can we move from our places of power and privilege to create more space for those who don't have that power and privilege? I think that so many of us, myself included, have power and privilege that we can share, that we can leverage for the sake of others. Like, just using myself as an example, I don't like to try to invite people into practices that I don't practice myself. I try to hold myself to the same standard of accountability. And so I think about, we mentioned homophobia, and I think about how that's connected to heteronormativity and patriarchy, and what are the ways that me as a heteronormative dude, like, how am I using my voice and using my platform and using my space to advocate for my friends and family who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, right? That's how you leverage your power and privilege. And then if I have friends and family who are white, what are they saying and doing in their positions of power and privilege to advocate for me? And that is what I see as the vision of collective healing and liberation, because you can't have collective liberation without the collective, right? Like, we're all
right,
all in this thing. It's like you talked about, like, how sometimes the oppressions can be compared and contrast, and I've heard that called the oppression Olympics, right? But I've also heard, on the converse side of that, I've also heard of what's called the oppression, the anti-oppression Olympics, right? Where how can we not be competitive but be collaborative in helping everyone get free? Because when one is bound, then none are free. How do we make this about unifying across our lines of difference for the sake of the whole? This isn't about Black people versus white people. This is about everybody versus racism, right? At the end of the day, it's not about, to me, it's not about straight people versus queer people. It's about everybody versus homophobia and queerphobia and transphobia. You know what I mean? Like, how do we have that recognition of the intersectionality of our struggle for healing and liberation? Because, like, my life, I lose something. I lose part of my humanity when another human being is being crushed by a system that I'm complacent and complicit in, right? So to me, there's no neutrality. Either I'm trying to create change, or I'm like fine with the status quo. Like, it's one or the other.
One of my favorite quotes I just heard recently, which I don't even know who said it, but it's, if you're not changing it, you're choosing it.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
that one.
And I really like the calling out but calling in. I think I'm guilty of doing the first without the second a lot. Just I had a conversation with a friend recently who brought up how intense I can get on social media with certain topics and stuff. And that's a common response I get in those conversations on social media is like, if you don't like it, just scroll past it. But I think scrolling past it is part of that complicity. And I think that there's probably a medium between what I do and what they're suggesting. But I think that the very least you can do is to not allow for there to be misrepresentation of reality. To say that racism isn't a part of America is harmful to scroll past. At the same time, I can also see where berating somebody for saying it without that maybe not forward invitation into the collective can also be harmful and also keep people at arm's length. But then I also think, as you were talking about how things compound, and there's an epidemic right now of Black trans women being murdered. And to think about, just having one label makes you susceptible to discrimination or even violence. But as those add up, it just gets worse and worse. And so when people with a plethora, Black gay woman or Black trans woman, how much more intensely they must feel to hear things like racism isn't a thing in America or homophobia isn't a thing in America. But obviously, you're not going to be able to change everybody, which is the sad reality to have to grasp. And so the way that sometimes you're able to tip the scale in that sense is through legislation and through law. What do you see going forward as a possible avenue to take? I know that you're not a politician, but what do you think would be a good piece of legislation to move in the right direction from where we're at following George Floyd and the insurrection activities? Because I even see, something I heard recently that I found interesting was overseas, when the United States goes into, stop a dictator or to, insert democracy into a society, the things that they look for as red flags in individuals, whether or not they have a paramilitary background, whether or not, they are, how conservative they are. These different things are the opposite of how they look at domestic terrorism. And so we see the effects of that on January 6th, where this group of conservative white men, with a lot of whom had a paramilitary background, are able to negatively affect society because of that. And I see the pictures between how DC looked with Black Lives Matter protests and how it looked on January 6th. And I can't help but think that there's I mean, it goes without saying there's more that the government can be doing to bring about positive change or get us to the place that we're seeking. But what do you think the first step is in that?
Yeah, I look at, I follow where the money goes. That's like a big thing. I'm like, where are we investing our money and our resources? And there's definitely a disproportionate amount of money that goes towards, military and war and policing. And so what I would like to see is us like supporting the organizations and the people who are already doing things for the community, who are doing things that are proactive and preventative to, against crime and to sustain the health and well-being of people. And so, health services and people just, I think we need to put more funding into that, that kind of stuff. That would be the main thing that I would want to focus on if I were a politician. I'm never going to be a politician. I'm not trying to run for anything or anybody. I'm an artist, and my role in the world is to speak truth, and to cultivate joy and beauty. And so, how can we like speak truth and cultivate joy and beauty, even in the political sphere? Because I do think it's possible. It's not easy, but I do think it's possible. And how can we make space for that? How can we create laws that are going to be protecting the most vulnerable people instead of protecting the most powerful people? Because right now, that's what most of our laws do. Like it's not, legality is not a sense of morality. It has nothing to do with morality. It has everything to do with power and protecting those who already have power so they can get more power and accumulate more wealth and resources. But how can we shift that to protect folks who don't have a lot of power, who are vulnerable, who are marginalized? That's where I want to see some shifts. And I won't say like I know all the laws, like the particular laws that need to change to make that happen. But I do know that if our system was one that tended to the most vulnerable people, we wouldn't be having the experiences that we're having. We wouldn't be talking about half the things that we've talked about on this podcast right now, because they just wouldn't happen. So,
right. That I think you're right on the money. Right on the money. Something I heard, I want to say recently. I always say I heard things recently, and then as I think about it, it's like years ago. So I don't know how recently I heard this, but I heard that people don't have drug problems. They have life problems that they solve with drugs, or that they treat with drugs. And I think that idea can be used in a lot of different situations, like what you were just talking about. I think about how popular the dumbass phrase black on black crime has become. And I think about, like people don't, I've had my fair share of experiences in the drug community, to know that nobody grows up wanting to be a drug dealer. Nobody intentionally gets into criminal activity because they think it'll be fun. And I see, like the thing is like black on black crime happens because historically after segregation, they were still segregated. And so it wasn't that they were doing black on black crime. It's just that's the people that were around when the crime was taking place, because there wasn't integration. But also, if we were to fit, like if people were able to live the life that we are all looking to live, or like the bare minimum that we're looking to have, that's spelled out in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence about these God-given rights that we see but don't acknowledge often in the modern day. If those were, like, if what we wrote back then were true today, we would not have the problems that we have today. Yeah. So in that, you do a lot with your community. You said you're not a politician. You're never going to be a politician, but you speak truth and love in a way that brings about justice. How are you doing that now? I know that you have a new project, Show Up. Kind of expand on that or what that means.
Yeah. So I'm doing a collaborative music project called Show Up, and it's based off of a poem that I wrote a few years ago called Show Up, same title. But perhaps one of my most popular poems to date. I think it resonates with a lot of people because it speaks to just the beauty and the power of showing up as your most authentic self, like whatever that even means, because sometimes we don't feel as authentic as we would like to, or we don't show up as best as we would like to. But I still think that's something that, as long as we're doing our best and trying to show up, I think that something special happens there. And so I wrote a piece kind of just affirming that and celebrating that. And then I wanted to hear what other artists and other organizers and just community folks, what they felt about showing up for themselves, for their family, for their ancestors. What does that mean to others as well? And so I invited people to share via monologues and via music and poetry. And so it's a collaborative project that I'll be releasing here soon. Ideally by early March is what we're looking at right now. Because we're still doing some mixing and mastering and piecing together some of the final pieces. I'm really excited to get it all wrapped up with a bow on top of it so I can gift it to the world. But we have some really dope tracks on there, and I really hope that it offers some encouragement, some motivation. I think we're in such a historic moment right now, whether it's because of the global pandemic, but also the George Floyd uprisings and just so many other things that folks are going through right now. I think that we need a radical reminder of who we are and what's possible when we do show up. And so that's what this music project is about. It's saying, hey, like, don't forget who you are, who you come from, who's around you. There, you can find healing. It's possible. You can find hope. It's possible. So
now, RuPaul, a drag queen, she often says, "You're born naked, and the rest is drag." And expanding on that a little bit, a lot of people's idea, especially those outside of the LGBTQIA community, view drag as just female impersonation. And it gets its start there, and it's rooted in that. I mean, the term drag comes from the way petticoats drag on the floor. And that's based off of in Shakespeare's time when men played women, and they would dress as women, how their petticoats dragged, and they would often wear that to go to these secret meetings because of how homosexuality wasn't permissible in those times. But on that, the idea is just putting on a persona that is different from who you are. And everybody knows a different version of you. Like when we go and we meet people, they're meeting somebody different than, another person will meet from us. And oftentimes those things aren't intentional, and they're based off of a feeling of expectation, or based off of a reality that isn't 100% accurate to reality. And I think that at the root, what we saw on January 6th was people showing up with this persona based off of this incorrect view or this distorted view of reality. And I think that your project and showing up and being able to show the reality is specifically now for Black people in America will help break that reality and make that positive shift that people can kind of take off these ideas or these personas that they feel they need to have because of. So I'm really excited to hear what you're cooking up in the kitchen. I know if it's anything like your mom's chicken, it's going to be delicious.
Yeah, I love that. I love that relationship. I never thought about that. I get my creative art skills from the way my mama cooks in the kitchen. I inherited it in a different capacity, in a different manifestation, but it's still the same love language in a different, maybe the same love in a different language that I inherited.
There you go. Yeah. So I'm really excited to hear that. Where can people find you outside of the screen that they're looking at now?
Yeah. I mean, it would still maybe be on the screen if they typed in joedavispoetry.com. They can find most of my stuff there, or really just Joe Davis Poetry on any social media platform. They do Joe Davis Poetry on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, even Snapchat. I don't really use Snapchat a whole lot, but it's on there too.
I was just bracing myself to hear you say TikTok. I didn't want to cringe in front of you, but I may have.
So the secret is that I actually do have a TikTok that I don't really use because I'm just not there yet. I don't get it. I like to watch the hilarious TikTok videos, but I have yet to create my own. I'm like, how do people have time to like do this, like multiple angles and great lighting? And I'm like, oh my god, like we have like young amateur filmmakers that were this next generation. They're so freaking creative. It's wild. But I don't have the time in my schedule to be developing these intricately designed TikTok videos.
I will say I like what it's done for creativity, and I do enjoy watching them, but just I don't know, and it makes me feel old, my aversion to it. I wonder if it would even be
sorry, are you a millennial?
I am, yeah,
I'm there with you.
Hi, I'm Brian, and I'm a millennial. Hi, Brian. Well, thank you for having this conversation and sharing your experience.
Most def. Yeah, I'm really grateful to share, and this was a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much.
And that concludes today's episode of the Gift of Gab podcast. You can check out Joe Davis online at joedavispoetry.com, as well as his other social networking platforms. I hope that today's conversation was enlightening and brought some information that you might be able to share with others in your life to help us take another step towards progress in creating the world that we all want to live in. Until next time, I'm Gabe Bryan, and thank you for listening.